I'm Mark Seifter.
And I'm Linda Zies Palmer.
And this is Arcane Mark. Hello and welcome to Arcane Mark. GM Tools Pacing Campaigns. Now, this is one that was asked for by someone who was watching the show, had seen our episodes on pacing encounters, pacing sessions, but not on pacing your entire campaign.
So one thing to talk about at the start is that if you are pacing something like a show or a novel or something like that where you don't know, or at least it's probably a little more like a novel because a show could have more collaborators or things like that. But if you're pacing something like a novel and you're writing it all and things like that, then you are going to be thinking about everything holistically from the beginning to end. You're not going to have like people who are coming in who might do something or random events that might occur that you wouldn't expect. They're going to take things in different directions. So this allows for you as someone who's creating a campaign to do things in a wide spectrum. You might be, on one hand, you're the GM who's putting a few things in front of the players and seeing what happens, and then developing from there. And then on the other end, you may be running from something like a pre-written campaign or something that you've planned out in great detail.
And there's all sorts of games that are in between those two extremes.
And also, no matter how much you plan and prepare and expect, shenanigans can and will still happen.
Even a pre-written adventure path is not completely set in stone, and even a reactive to the player's adventure path is not completely chaotic and unexpected.
Yeah.
There are some of these tips for pacing your campaigns that will apply across the entire spectrum of campaigns, but there's a fair variety of tips that only apply in one part of that spectrum or another. So we're going to break down the tips for you in pacing your campaign, and we'll let you know if this is something that's more or only applicable on a more structured campaign versus a sort of more sandboxy reactive campaign, or it's a universal campaign pacing tip.
So as far as universal tips, a good campaign is going to have some moments where things are difficult and challenging and hectic, and some moments where things calm down a bit and the PCs can rest and regroup and have downtime in between.
That's true. Now, some GMs like to continually escalate and keep players on their toes, but it tends to be more effective, just as we talked about in our other pacing episodes for shorter term pacing. In the long term, if you follow a vaguely sort of sine-like function that is oscillating up and down, but the vacillations get to higher and higher peaks every time, instead of a monotonically increasing, going up and up and up and up constantly.
It keeps going the same way, yeah. You're going to want people to be able to generally take a breath. And now the size of those breaths might depend upon the kind of campaign that you're running. You could have a campaign where, you're generally fighting like more of a monster of the week type thing, and then the PCs have plenty of time to rest and recuperate back to full before they go on their next adventure and they have a stable home base. Or your campaign might be something that's moving at a faster clip, and maybe those periods of rest and recuperation are just long enough to get their feet back under them, but you can't teleport over somewhere or commission a magic item or that kind of stuff.
That's right. So in general, the pace of your campaign is going to be a recipe that involves multiple ingredients. When you're pacing a session, usually you don't have to worry so much about putting lots of ingredients together and following a specific recipe, because most sessions have certain pacing and structural elements that are the same or similar regardless of what kind of session. But for a campaign, you need to take these recipe pieces in consideration. You need to take in consideration the theme of your campaign.
Yes.
You need to take into consideration your players and you, and what sort of pacing works best for you. If you have a pre-written adventure path, take into consideration what's written already. You don't have to follow it strictly as a Bible that you can't possibly move away from, but at the very least, you want to know what direction and what pacing that the pre-written adventure is pushing you towards.
And so one part of that is that it really, really helps to read the whole adventure before you get started. Because then when you make a change, you're aware that you've made a change and you can think about how that's going to impact things later on, instead of making a change and then you realize 2 books later, oh wait, I killed off this character, but them still being alive is a vital part of part 7 of this adventure. Now I need to go back and redo all of this stuff.
That's right. So pacing of campaigns is sort of dealt with in a few different steps. And depending on what kind of campaign you're building, the amount of time you spend in each of these steps will change. And it might be almost 0 in one of the types of steps. Mm-hmm. So one of the ways that you can spend pacing campaigns is macro. You take a step back at the big picture. This is especially important for a pre-written adventure where it's generally assumed that you're mostly going to be following along with that adventure route. In the macro campaign pacing, you want to take a look at the pre-written adventure. Try to analyze what has been written. If you're writing it yourself, do it as you're coming up with the adventure. If you're not, make sure you read what the adventure authors have read. Look for points in the adventure of rising action, climax, falling action, points of a sort of peaceful interlude where there's a little downtime, or notice if there isn't any and see if you need to put them in. Try to make, it doesn't have to be like mathematically perfect, but just a little graph. It doesn't even have to be really a graph. It could just be like a vague diagram.
Up and down and that kind of thing.
And see what direction that campaign is moving in that you found in the adventure path or that you were writing yourself.
Another thing to consider if you're working with something pre-written is that what the adventure seems to expect will be challenging may not be the same kinds of things that are challenge or impactful, may not be the sorts of things that are challenging or impactful for your players and their characters. So if there's something that is, supposed to be really hard, but you know that your characters are really going to be able to blaze through it, then, you can decide, hey, the story really wants this section to be more of a challenge, so I'm going to change it so that it's something that, while they can still definitely succeed and feel good about their abilities, there's still going to be some aspect of that in the challenge. Or I'm going to recast this, treat this as something that's intended to be easier in the story and not count on this to be like the big moment. Maybe this is going to be more of like a release of tension of like, aha, we totally defeated this. Or, on the flip side, something that the campaign expects to be pretty straightforward, and hey, the campaign doesn't think that getting across a river at 6th level is going to be really hard for a group, but my group is full of Clanky McClankerson in full plate armor and nobody took athletics, so like this is going to be like a really tense and difficult moment.
That actually happened in a game you weren't in. It wasn't 6th level. It was like 2nd level, and there was like a river ford. It was like a DC 5 swim check to cross the ford. And so I told everyone, look, it's DC 5. You have to fail by 5 or more to even be drowning. So I think we can just say that you guys crossed this, even though there are enemies behind you and like time does matter. You're not going to fail that many times. And one of the player of the cleric was like, well, hold on. In my half plate, it's actually quite possible for me to fail that DC 5 by 5 or more. Let me roll it. And he did multiple times in a row, and he had to use his summon, celestial dolphin spell to get to safety. And it was very close to his 2nd level cleric dying in a DC 5 swim check. So you're not wrong that it's possible. It's in a more likely scenario, it would be something like where the adventure that you've written or the pre-published adventure assumes that like the political terms of this alliance with this noble house are just, in the background, and you're like, no, my players are going to spend 3 hours determining exactly which grain field is being traded for what vineyard in great detail. They're going to want to completely make sure that they got a good deal on that political bargain, so I'm going to need to detail it out more. The important thing of what Linda was saying, though, is that you need to think about both the amount of time in the real world and the emotional importance, the number of like beats or scenes in the hypothetical movie or play that you're not a director of, but that is playing out with all the people.
Like what Mark's saying there, whereas if the author of the campaign may have expected it as like, you just kind of in the background show a scene where like they're crossing the river as a part of their long thing. you know, what he just saw there was something where it was like dramatic music zooming in and and it was a life or death situation.
Yup. I wrote that adventure and I thought I could just fast forward through it, but the player wanted to remind me he was very bad at swimming. And he totally was.
Mm-hmm. I see a comment, downtime is the trickiest part of pacing. You want the campaign to have a sense of urgency, but some downtime is very helpful, and often those two are in conflict. I find that when downtime is limited, it's useful to let the players know up front that the downtime is going to be limited, so that they know, like, oh, I have to decide what I'm going to do in this time. You know, if you are in a situation where the enemy army is approaching and your scouts tell you that you have 5 days, those 5 days are still going to feel pretty tense, even if you're doing, you know, some more typical things during that time, because the counter is ticking and you know you're not going to be able to do everything you might want to do.
On the other hand, if you push back the Empire's army and winter fell and the snow was covering everything up and the common sense for war in your world in this particular climate is there's no way they're going to continue the fight during the winter. They had to retreat back to the Empire. Then you know that you have a few months before hostilities begin again.
Mm-hmm.
For downtime, if you want to try diplomacy, if you want to sneak into the Empire, any of those kinds of things, that big war battle that you were dealing with right before then is not going to start again until the spring.
But in that case, in order to assist with that time, if you don't have a lot of other events or things planned for that time, you might want to go ahead and zoom back the focus so that instead of spending, you know, lots of sessions going day by day what you're doing during there, it's like, okay, you know, you have like 12 weeks. You know, what kinds of things do you want to do? Okay, well, this kind of thing would take a couple of weeks to do. So you break it down into smaller chunks.
So Linda is now discussing one of the number one tools that you have in your toolkit for pacing campaigns, whether they're reactive sandboxes or near total railroads in a pre-written campaign, and that is called time control. If it was a superpower in real life, it would be one of the most powerful superpowers, but you have the ability to not only decide how much real world time that you want to like devote and how much attention, as I was talking about before, but you can just kind of zoom right past weeks and just be like, okay, during these weeks, you know what, you were working at your business, roll, earn income, and you said you were crafting items, so you were able to do that, and you were looking for new spells and you found these 3 spells. Or you can play out every single one of those days with special downtime events.
And in between, you know, you can be like, you were... another thing that can work well is, you know, you were looking for spells, and then there's one event that happens through the process of searching for spells, or one event that happens through the process of crafting things. So instead of playing day by day, it's like, okay, you were doing this thing for a month, and here's an interesting event that happened during that time.
That's true. One way to think about it as well, if you're trying to thread that needle, and you aren't sure, you're just like, you know what? Mark and Linda said we should know our group, and some groups want to do tons of detail, and some groups want to hand wave it all. But I don't know yet. I haven't done this a lot of times. What's a good rule of thumb? One good rule of thumb that you might want to consider is having, especially if it's a long period of time that passed, but you don't want to play it all out, consider giving each of the PCs who did something during that long period of time 3 different things that happened. One of which was almost purely upside, or an opportunity for an upside of what they were trying to do. One of which is a complication or problem that is an issue for what they were trying to do and is generally negative. And one of which is more neutral, but if they handle it right, it can turn to an upside too, more likely than a downside. So that as a net, it skews a little bit towards positivity, but there's still some uncertainty there.
And they may be able to ultimately come out with it all being positive if they then take that negative thing as, okay, this is an adventure hook, we now need to handle this and resolve this. But,
or if the negative thing was neutralized because they handled it, then they could wind up with like plus on the positive getting even more positive, plus on the neutral one, and neutral on the negative one by just handling everything appropriately. Or like Linda said, it could turn into even the positive ones could turn into a hook for a new adventure.
Yeah.
Where it's like, not only did I find the spell or magic item I asked for, but the reason that they found it was because there was an ancient ruin where a bunch more of these kind of spells that I liked are there.
But you know, the the archaeologists who were starting to explore it had to run away because the monsters there were too dangerous. And I learned that they're looking for a team to go in there, so we can try to convince people to let us be the team that goes in.
That's right. So in general, following some kind of rule that is like vaguely skewed towards positive opportunities, but gives like a mix of things so that you can see what is sort of happening, gives a sense of some sort of a sense of realism, like working a job, doing something in a long time of downtime. There's going to be some wrinkles. Mm-hmm. There's going to be some positive outcomes. That's a way that you can kind of go fast quickly. You can go even more quickly if you don't do 3 per person, especially if there's only a little bit of downtime. Yeah,
and you can also observe how the players respond to these kinds of things. If the player's response is, okay, cool, then, maybe that player isn't as interested in engaging with the kinds of things that their character is doing during downtime. Whereas if the player is like, oh, and now I want to do this kind of thing and this and that and the other thing, then okay, that's a player who's more interested in engaging in that sort of thing. And there is room in extreme cases, this is something that I've had happen in one of my campaigns notably, for doing some of that downtime stuff offline with one of the players if they really want to get into some details and you don't want your rest of your table to sit through like hours of them doing something, and you're both down for that. But
that's right. So being able to do a sidebar or side session is an advanced pacing technique that works for people if you have enough time in your schedule to do it. It can also help save the time of your other players if their characters are not involved in a particular thing.
Mm-hmm. And you can also use that in general, the offline time for, let's say you're not actually just running something offline, but your players are having trouble deciding what they want to do. Getting things on pace by finding a way to, cut there and then say, okay, next week, I know we've talked over some of the options. We have a sense of where we might be going. And then, hey, think about it before next week, and then we'll continue. And we can decide what we're doing then.
In some ways, that ability to, if your players actually listen to you when you say that, to use offline time can allow you to save the time that you're on during the session.
And realistically, everybody's probably not going to do that. But if you have, like, 1 or 2 facilitators who actually thought about it, or, like, at least remembered half an hour before the session and then took a minute to be like, oh, crud, right, we were supposed to think about this thing, then you'll start farther along than you stopped. So and it'll save time.
We gave you a few techniques here for how to figure out what to do with pacing when you're analyzing that campaign. But we're still on the macro level. You've analyzed it. There might be some actual issues, even with a pre-published adventure, either overall or for your group, where you realize that it fits together and there's not enough falling action. That is one of the ones that's most common, where it just goes beat to beat, and the moment you get back from beating this thing, you're accused of being a criminal and have to go run away, and then it's just like it constantly is just one thing after another, and you have no time to take a breath.
Well, a lot of published adventures really struggle with page count restrictions.
Absolutely.
And they also don't know your group, so they don't know what things your group is going to be most interested in. So they focus more on, here's the big, shiny action. Also, they, sometimes with those, other thing to watch for is how much are your characters and your players, how much do you expect they're going to pick up on the connective tissue? And this is something you may not know outright, but, I saw Marcus typing.
Yeah, I was just typing something.
Okay, yeah. This is something you may pick up, throughout the campaign because you realize it didn't work to start with. But let's say that the adventure assumes that the characters are following the chain of MacGuffins to go somewhere, and your characters don't seem particularly interested in following that chain, or like the adventure assumes that your characters are going to follow along with what Grandy Rohit says in his schemes to make reference to or one of our other characters that we had in our recent
King of the Castle
game. And then like your players are like, nah, or your players are like, let's say that like the campaign and your players aren't going to bite that hook, or like you know that if somebody comes and asks the PCs to do something, then the PCs are like, well, what's in it for me? You have to prove for this to me, or I don't trust you. I'm going to do this big investigation. Like those kinds of if your characters have ways that they typically respond to types of situations, you can kind of plan for that and then decide, like, okay, I either need to budget for them to be suspicious of everyone who breathes, or find some way to convince them to trust this person.
That's right.
So that it doesn't, like, derail into...
So there are certain things that are only true about your players.
Mm-hmm.
And like Linda said, the word count is very harsh. So in many cases, there could be pacing concerns partially due to word count that are true for almost every group.
Yeah, but to go back for a sec, I was thinking a little bit, but I think the main point that I was saying is that, like, when you're considering an arc of a campaign, you know, considering how they're going to follow that loop and making sure that you think they're actually going to go along with it is important.
That's true. Mm-hmm. If you try to pace a campaign and then the group doesn't even do anything remotely resembling the campaign that you paced, then your pacing was kind of worthless.
Yep.
And it's going to not help you at all. Any other planning you did was also going to go down the wayside, though, not just the pacing planning. The pacing planning is probably the least of your worries at that point in time. Now, this kind of macro pacing that you do in the big picture is not as important if your campaign is more of a reactive sandbox. In that case, while you may have done a lot of planning ahead of time of like what's in each area that the PCs are moving into if it was a space-based sandbox, or what actions will each NPC take at how much time and resources will it take for them to do it if the PCs just don't do anything. Here's the timeline of what will happen, and let's see how the PCs put a monkey wrench in that. If you're a time-based sandbox that's reactive.
So a time-based sandbox, then it's more like, you know, this is the time when that happens without any interference from the PCs, so you know that there are going to be big dramatic confrontations, but whether they happen because the PCs are racing in at the nick of time to stop the opponents, whether they happen because the PCs confronted their opponents earlier, maybe when they didn't have as many resources and they were lower level, and so it was a knockdown, drag-out thing, but then they got a major victory, or whether they, you know, the opponent succeeded in their plans and then they had to, like, clean up the mess afterwards.
Or maybe the PCs delayed a particular player in the complex set of time-based things you were saying would happen to the point that they never got to do their scheme, and somebody else was able to accomplish a scheme that would have otherwise been blocked if it weren't for the PCs delaying the Lich King, who never takes control of the Orcish Horde, and allowing an Orc War Chief who would have otherwise been crushed opposing the Lich King to come in control. Now the Orc Horde is marching.
Yeah. So removing one threat can cause other potential dangers to come in and fill the void.
And you don't have to have planned all that in advance. The point is that you may have some structure you've pre-built, but it's not going to give you your pacing for sure. Instead, you're going to be reacting to what the players do. One of the advantages, in theory, of pacing a campaign based on what the players do is that, in theory, the players are doing what they wanted to do, and so therefore, theoretically, it's going to match the pace that the players want. In practice, there are many times that the players will create a pace that they themselves do not actually want while moving through a reactive sandbox because of the fact that they're not thinking about, like, game design of getting the pace that they want. They're just kind of reacting at the time.
Yeah. For example, they might play their characters as being very cautious and slow to approach things. Where they would have more fun if, you know, there was more pressure to get things done, but they're like, well, my character wouldn't feel the need to rush through this. They just take it at a comfortable pace and make sure it was safe.
That's right. That's a good example of that. But other examples could be in the opposite, where they maybe would have actually had more fun taking some time to smell the roses, but they feel like since you didn't give them a strict structure of things, you didn't tell them, well, you know what, we're kind of railroading until you have 5 days. They're like, I have to spend every day doing things because any time could be something.
The evil overlord could trigger the apocalypse any day, so we need to.
And we don't even have a set evil overlord. So there's infinitely many evil overlords who could trigger infinitely many apocalypses. We have to completely work the maximum amount of speed because every day, if there's no time that there's a time pressure, then that means every time is time pressure. Unlimited days off means no days off.
Yeah.
Like, that's a serious thing. I'm not even I'm not making this up. This is something that some groups will do when you give them sort of a more sandboxy approach.
And it's one thing that I learned as as I got more experience as a role player, that it's more fun to think about, like, when is my character just done? They're tired. They've been through a lot. They're not going to go do this dangerous stuff unless, like, they absolutely have to. Like, now they're going to take a break, and they're going to stop, and they're going to process what's happened, and they're going to think about how that might change what they do in the future, what they've learned from the situation. And, if they can't, and, things just keep going, then, it's like, okay, well, I can play them as being more flustered, as, like, they've been facing these ridiculous situations day in and day out.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So, you might think at first, reactive campaign, I don't need to think about pacing because I'm just doing what my players want, so they'll naturally like it for sure. But you do have to think about it anyway. In that case, what you should try to do, if you can, instead of this, like, sort of macro, like, sort of, I've got my Xanatos-like scheme of what's going on in the background, you should use improv techniques. This is still useful, even if you are running a pre-published adventure or one that you've pre-written. Use improv techniques in order to control the tempo and pace based on what you've learned that your players enjoy. And that allows you to sort of structure things from session to session and from campaign to campaign. When you see that something is potentially naturally moving towards a break point, you can use improv techniques to get to that. Now, when you're doing the macro, we talked about some of the side techniques of how to figure this out, but one thing I forgot to say is once you've, like, reassessed that graph, you want to draw some lines at climactic points and post-climactic points where you think that sessions and arcs might end. Obviously, you might not be right. That's in the less improvised campaign. But you can generally end sessions, like, at any point other than that, but when you have this really good ending point, it's going to be really weird if you go very slightly past that for a couple hours and then end a session. So you're going to want to come with foreknowledge that there's a good chance that the session is going to end at that point or an arc's going to end at that point, and not, like, start a session that you think has, like, 30 minutes until it gets to one of those points, but instead be like, hey guys, can we stay for an extra half hour? I think we're going to get to an important point. Similarly, in improv-based campaigns,
or if you know that there's a hard cutoff, make your previous sessions shorter so that you can, like, split it up.
Correct.
And then have that whole last chunk together.
It's usually easier in improv-based campaigns, but you still need to take a look at what your session timing is. Take a look at the way that this improvised arc and story is moving. And in this case, rather than setting anything up in advance, you're kind of reading the tea leaves as they come along and trying to sort of build a graph of what your players are doing and find a satisfying point to potentially end an arc. And there may not even be visible arcs, but at least end at some kind of satisfying point to move on to something else rather than just sort of be a continuous grind. This is because it makes stories more satisfying, even sandboxy ones, if you have these sort of narrative inflection points.
And when you consider where to pause, it's not always when everything's been resolved. It's pretty effective to pause, like, on that big cliffhanger, where you have just enough information given about what's coming next for the players to be excited about what they're about to do.
So Rohit asked a really good question. What do you do if your players have drastically different expectations of pacing? This can be a problem and one that you're going to want to think about how you're going to handle it. There are multiple answers for how you can deal with it. Usually the best solution is to talk about it out of character. If players definitely have different expectations and they know that they do, that's good. If they don't know that they do, it can be a little harder.
You might start to see, for example, that the player who wants action, when things get into, like, some of the slower downtime, maybe they pull out their phone and they're not engaged in what's going on. Or the player who is who prefers, like, a slower pace, it gets kind of overwhelmed by the pace of the adventure, and again, maybe they pull out their phone because they're overstimulated and like, oh my gosh, like.
I'm not saying that the phone is the root of all evil here, but it is a potential symptom that could have a cause.
Well, I'm using it as a shorthand for any other obvious sign that they're not engaging directly with what you're doing.
So whether you needed a sign or just people directly told you that they knew that their pacing wasn't being met, or you were able to analyze it even without a phone, whatever the case may be, it's typically best to try to discuss it out of character. And if the expectations are very different and irreconcilable in such a way that you can't be like, well, we'll do some fast and some slower, you might want to start different campaigns because maybe that's not the right group. There are other ways that groups handle it sometimes, and they are typically not the best. For example, if you're just like, well, expectations are expectations, and in character, you can just decide what you're going to do. We're playing sandboxy. You'll find that fast-paced person is the one who's going to actually set the pace, and slow-paced person just gets wrecked. Because if slow-paced person, let's take some time off. I'm going to go and run my bar. Fast-paced person's like, okay, so what do you do, fast-paced person? And it's like, all right, while they're doing that, I go to the Orcish stronghold. It's like, wait, shouldn't we go as a group? Nah, whatever, you're doing your bar.
You're taking too long.
You're doing your bar, but the warlord that didn't work with the liches that we stopped could attack at any time, so I'm going to the orc stronghold. Anyone who wants to can come with me.
And it's like, well, I guess I can't do my bar thing because they're riding along to the orc stronghold.
So generally, the pace will move to the speed of the person who's willing to try to make it move the fastest.
Unless you repeatedly countermand that, and then that could get that player frustrated. Like if you're like, well, you can't go there yet because the captain of the guard said that area is off limits until 2 days from now because he needs to prepare an attack. A joint assault or whatever.
That is not only true in a macro situation, like moving to the next entire storyline, but it's true in a micro situation where people are talking about the treaty and the vineyards versus the fields, and the barbarian gets out an axe and then it's like, I chop my axe into the middle of the table and say, enough talk! So that's actually the one you hear about more in sort of like advice columns or questions about campaigns, is the micro version of this. But in general, it's true that if you say that in character is what determines everything, then the most impatient person is the one who tends to be able to take control of it.
Because, as soon as the barbarian uses their axe to chop the table, that fundamentally changes the scene.
Absolutely. So that is why I suggest using it out of character.
That tends to be something that requires like sort of an out of character thing, because like, you know, if Grongtar is smashing the table, you know, and you as the GM look around and all the other players are like we were enjoying this or whatever, then, you know, talking to the Grongtar player about like, you know, some way that they can sort of handle this thing, or like, you know, Grongtar puts their hand on their axe and then like sees that like the bodyguard is like taking a lot of attention, and then like, you know, Grongtar, you know, can roll a society check and realize, you know, actually this would cause some serious problems and I wouldn't be able to get what I wanted later on if I smashed the table. Give them some way to explain so they feel like they can still like express their character moving toward the thing, or like moving toward or expressing how they're feeling without like disrupting other people's ability to.
And they might not care about getting the thing later on. Now, if your visceral response to my saying that doing it in character is usually not a great solution because the most impatient person is going to be the one who can take control of it in character, is like, well, hold on. Our policy is also to do it in character, but you know what? Jill, who plays Grongtar, would never do that because she knows we would all get really mad that she split the table with the axe. Guess what? You weren't actually resolving it in character. You were resolving it sort of passively out of character with the fact that Jill knew that everyone would get mad. And so now she is self-policing herself based on a conversation that your group didn't have with each other about what people wanted to do. And it would be easier to just explicitly have it out of character rather than actually reality have it out of character and claim it was.
But also character. Then look for an opportunity where Grongtar can smash the axe on the table and it's not gonna like break everything that the other characters are trying to do. But it can still cause an interesting complication, so they can express that. And I see a question here: is it ever advisable, acceptable to let Grongtar run off with his axe and fight the orcs alone and get wiped out? I think it depends on the player. Like, if you have clearly warned the player, like, hey, Grontar, that this orc stronghold is really dangerous, and Grontar's chances of actually successfully wiping this out on his own are very low. And Grontar, and then, then we start to get into sort of some of the things we've talked about before when PCs are way in over their heads. Like, maybe Grontar fights some orcs in the front room and they're not taking him seriously. But then he's like, oh my gosh, and he's all beat up after his first battle or what have you. And then he hears the sound of like another dozen orcs rampaging down in the distance. And he has time to run away instead of being killed. But then it's like, oh, wait, yeah, actually, the orc stronghold was very strong.
It's possible you can make it work where all the other characters are doing the plot that is kind of what was expected, and one person has a terrible plan and goes and runs off and randomly does it, sort of distracting attention from everyone else. But you're going to wind up with something that is polarizing, and some people like it and some people won't. Like, for example, in the movie The Last Jedi, where everybody was doing something and then one person had another plan and ran off to some casino place, and just like in this example, it was something that the GM, in this case the director, wanted to punish them for doing. And so they came back, everyone was like, you're terrible, why did you do this, it messed us all up. And like, that was a very polarizing result due to the fact that like random reckless heroism in other Star Wars movies was sometimes rewarded. And I guess my point being that if your group also thought that was cool, and would have thought that was cool if they were playing the characters who went off and did that side quest and not just watching it happen to them on the movie, it might be right for your group to do something like that. But be aware that there are a significant percentage of people that get turned off by that approach.
Also, it's much more likely to be something that your group wants if, like, I was taking this from the perspective of everyone else wanted to wait and see, and then Grontar is like, Leroy! Versus the perspective of, like, if people wanted their characters to go in and have, like, a more bold frontal assault on the fortress or what have you.
Also, your ability to let them Leroy and have negative consequences to just that character can be limited by the amount of empathy the characters have for the other characters, or the amount that they're willing to say, oh yeah, I'm going to keep making my sword. I'm going to keep running my bar. Grontar, he's dead, right? Oh yes, he's definitely going to die going after those orcs. Maybe he has a 10% chance to escape with his life, heavily wounded. But yeah, that's fine. Because a lot of times with the adventuring parties are like, no, we can't just leave Grontar to die and keep running the bar. And so they wind up getting pulled into it by the reverse of the example where Grontar's player Jill says, I'm not going to do this because I think other people get mad at me, where it's just like kind of social pressure to go and not let Jill get her character
I was assuming that Grontar just kind of left and decided to do this on his own without talking again to the other folks. He's like, I think we should go attack this. And then Grontar gets up and is like, I'm attacking the Orc Stronghold today. Who cares about getting those other people?
So this is all going back to what we said initially, which is having an out-of-character discussion so to make sure you know what people actually feel is key. Because you know what? It's maybe everybody in your group thinks it's awesome that Grontar goes off on his own. Doesn't even tell everybody that that's what he's doing. So there's no, like, guilting their characters into it. Because Grontar just shook his head. Just like, whatever.
And then out of character, they're all like, oh my god, Grontar.
And they're just all laughing their butts off while Grontar is getting, like, destroyed by these orcs. Maybe including Jill, who just thinks it's hilarious and that Grontar deserved it.
And then,
should learn a lesson.
And then you might be playing it more comedic. Like, maybe Grontar is, like, driven out and, like, is, like, running away and, like, survived, but is like, oh, I'm never gonna go there.
So that's possible. But if you didn't talk to your group in advance, it could be the opposite, where everybody is annoyed because Jill wanted Grontar to succeed at fighting the orcs alone. Everybody else didn't want to spend the time sitting there while Jill and Grontar were doing these things with the orcs that also might potentially cause the orcs to attack sooner because they got attacked and not give them time to run their bar. And so you can have very extreme reactions. You're not going to know what they are if you don't ask.
Yeah. And I guess I was also kind of assuming when I was saying this, Grontar is a difficult encounter and then here's other orcs coming in the distance. I kind of assumed that you weren't going to run this as a multi-encounter thing. You were going to do, like, one thing to demonstrate the danger and then have a very obvious hello giant blinking red danger sign. So it wouldn't take like as long to
even then,
do it, but yeah.
An encounter could take a while. It also depends on how fast your players are. If Jill's not that fast at making her round by round options, it could still take a while to run that encounter.
Mm-hmm.
If you're not fast at running a warband of orcs because you have to control a new number of orcs.
Yeah, well, I can imagine in this case to engage some of the other players, you could be like, all right, here's some stats
you
guys,
for orc play the orc warband.
You play the orc warband.
You need some catharsis with Gruntar.
It's like, now keep in mind, like they think that this person is a complete fool and they're toying with him, so they're not like gonna go straight for the kill here. They wanna, you know.
Right. So
Rowan's
wondering if there's balance issues based on pacing. It depends on what RPG you're playing. If you're playing Pathfinder 1st Edition, the characters can wind up being, like, literally...
You double your money with crafting.
Double their money, which sometimes can be 1.5 times or more if they get a very crucial item more powerful than they would have been with not being given that much downtime. In Pathfinder 2nd Edition, usually giving players a lot of downtime is not going to throw things off that much. The way that Earn Income and Crafting were created was such that you'd have to give them quite a lot of time before they get as much money as they would have done from doing, like, one full adventure. Like, and the amount of money that it would take to get up a level requires, like, months of downtime at max level job.
Now, this is the downtime based one, but there is a sense in which some characters are stronger if you zoom in and then if you repeat that a lot of times. So, for example, if you have a structure that's based on, like, we're going to have one encounter and then we're going to rest. We're going to have one encounter and then we're going to rest. Then characters who have limited resources, who are always going fresh into encounters, are going to be disproportionately powerful compared to ones who are able to keep going.
Also, if you have a powerful benefits that you offer from downtime in the pacing of your campaign that are, like, plot-based, it could raise the narrative impact of players whose characters have chosen skills that are very strong in that downtime meta. Mm-hmm. For instance, let's say you had something that was about making your opera better with performance. Mm-hmm. And so then anyone, if you really heavily focused on that, anyone with performance would be able to make more of an impact.
Or, speaking of something that reminded me of opera, in our Hell's Rebels game, we have, like, a ritualist. And so when we have more downtime, then we might have rituals that are coming into play. Whereas, so that's a benefit for the group for having had more time. But they're never, like, something that feels like, oh my gosh, this shatters everything. But it does help.
In some games it will, in some games it won't, is the answer. Pathfinder 2nd Edition is on the end where it's an advantage for sure, but it's not going to bust anything unless you're like, and then 5 years passed. Mm-hmm. That will, if 5 years passed and you just fast forward through it with Earn Income, that will definitely throw the tables all out of whack for
Another thing is that the PCs that could happen over long periods of time is the PCs might be able to find and gain access to a larger bevy of options. So if it's like, oh yeah, you know, now my wizard has been able to scribe 200 spells into his spell book because we had a giant downtime, you know, that might affect the balance of the wizard compared to, like, the sorcerer, for example, who has their spells and isn't going around getting a giant spellbook of 200 spells.
You might find that every time that the wizard still has their bonded focus for the day, that their turns take twice as long as they used to before they scribe 200 additional spells.
Yes.
Where they're like, oh my goodness, I'm going to, I have all these spells that I had prepared, and I don't even remember what they all do, and I can re-up any of those spells.
Hold on, I need to look this up.
It's even worse in Pathfinder 1, where they could actually cast any spell in their spellbook, and not just recast one of the ones they prepared.
Yeah.
Then it could take as much as 10 times as long, because they were like, ooh, we're in a bind. Let me read all of the spells in the entire list and all of the details to make sure there wasn't one that would get me out of this.
Or yeah, thanks to all this downtime, Sword Basement Wizard was able to crank out a lot of swords in their basement.
Yes, exactly.
So yeah, I would say if it starts to get to the point where something is going to feel unwieldy from the perspective of, like, we found a way to become over-treasured, or we found a way to get to get our hands on so many options that we're going to start running into issues of option paralysis, then that's where you might start to get concerned.
That's right. In general, that's not as big of a deal for pacing as making sure that it matches with the player's expectations and it making sure it matches with the emotional beats of your story and of the theme of the story. If the theme of the story is about dynasty building over the course of a long period of time, that's very different than if the theme is about like an apocalypse clock that's constantly ticking, where every 24 hours some major event happens.
Yeah, like in my Kingmaker campaign, there was a fighter who crafted an adamantine full plate, and it took him like a year to finish the thing. And so it was like a plot point where it's like, oh my gosh, you actually crafted this ridiculous armor. You never see one of these armors getting crafted, but it was like a long-term investment type thing.
That's right. Because we had enough adamantine to pay 1/3 of the cost and the out of that adamantine, but we didn't have an adamantine full plate.
Yes. But another thing that we did in that campaign, though, is because there was so much wealth, because there was so much crafting, because there was so much time, I was just like, all right, you know what? Wealth by level is an illusion. My characters are like triply over treasured. I will take that into account with how I balance my characters in PF1. So it doesn't mean you can't do those kinds of things. It just means that you want to account for it if it's something that's enough to budge your characters way off the baseline of like power or complexity.
That's right. So there's another question is from the opposite end, can there be too little downtime such that it causes a problem?
Yes. If there are certain things that your players really want their characters to be able to do. One of these examples is, so maybe they want to find like a spell, or they're like, oh, I just want to find this thing. Or like they want to retrain and they don't have time and they're like, I'm sick of this ability that I've had for 2 levels. I mean, there are certain things you can do to help with that. Like you can be like, all right, yeah, you know, you get access to a mystical force that allows you to quickly retrain this, or like, you know, you find that specific item.
Like Linda is saying, essentially, if you keep giving 0 downtime and push, you're going to need to find compromises where you essentially secretly give them downtime for free. But I mean, okay, yeah, that retraining was kind of minor, and it's sort of strictly an upgrade to what you have right now. I'll just give it to you for free. You're going to start hand-waving some things that normally would have cost downtime because you took a resource that was supposed to be in the game and you nearly completely removed it. You can usually get away with it without that much of an issue, like Linda was saying. Yeah.
So then you're still giving them that. It doesn't necessarily slow the pace, but at least gives them the resource.
Yep. And considering Warlock says sometimes you want to give them downtime, but they keep pushing. Like in the example that this is exactly the example I gave earlier for if you're not using a published adventure where you can just tell them in the published adventure nothing's going to happen, you have downtime, but you're playing a sandbox where they're like, well, unlimited vacation days means no vacation days.
Yeah.
And similarly, where it's like, every day we spend, something bad could be happening, we're never going to stop.
Yeah, I mean, there are sometimes ways to introduce plot beats that create a reason to be in an area for a while. Like, you know, the PC's having a mission that involves, like, helping to defend a settlement until a certain thing happens. You know, we need to wait for reinforcements and defend the settlement for a month until they do that or whatever. And it's like, okay, well, we're doing some defend the settlement activities, but we also have downtime while we're doing this task.
That's right. Another way you can create downtime is by...
If they always want to be like, I must be doing a mission.
Another way you can create downtime is by creating like a plot meta for your game, even if it is mostly a sandboxy reactive game, that sort of refuses to allow constant adventures to always be happening. For example, suppose you are in an area, let's say it's on the frontier, and there's monster attacks a lot, bandit attacks a lot, there's a lot of dangers, okay? But sometimes there aren't monsters or bandits attacking, and you don't have, say, a mega dungeon you can just go to and always constantly fight things. So at that point, at most, the players are still forced to spend downtime, even if they say, we want to fight. You can say, great, that means you're spending downtime surveying and canvassing the area, looking for bandit groups and monsters that are likely to pose a threat. Cool. Is anybody else spending their downtime on something else? Or if nobody spends downtime on that, you say, that's no problem. The settlement has scouts for a reason. The scouts maybe are not as good as Dahlia the Ranger at doing that. And that's okay, though, because Dahlia wants to craft bows. They'll do their best to get you that information anyway. You can keep doing your downtime. As soon as they come back, then you'll know there's some threat. You can go out.
I was just chuckling at the comment. We want to research the big bad. The library says the book was checked out and we'll be back in a month. Track down who took the book.
Dun, 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 dun. It was actually the big bad who was taking out all the books on themselves so that nobody could research them.
Yes. Or I actually thought one of the things that you were going to for that was the kinds of subsystems that give you rewards based on time passing. Like, we have an organization, and every month we get these kinds of benefits from that organization.
That could be nice, but it doesn't always work. Because if you have Kitsune Warlocks players, then they might be... Not only is it possible, I'm not saying these specific people, I don't know who your players are, but I've seen it happen where groups simultaneously realize they're going to get awesome benefits if they wait for a month, but also push it and then get mad that they didn't get the benefits for the month because they're like, this is so sad because our organization level is maxed to our character level and our character level is 14, our organization is level 3. Why is our organization so under leveled? And you're like, because I told you could take downtime and you never took it. The problem with the carrot is that if people are that motivated to push onward, it won't necessarily work. Whereas if the plot just won't advance in a sense because of the fact that they ran out of like high adventure things to do, there's not like a Lich King or a Orc Warlord that you can attack right now. That in a sandboxy campaign, that's actually often true.
Yeah.
And that tends to generally be a kind of rock solid way to make sure that there's some kind of downtime.
Absolutely. I was thinking about that also from the perspective of like if there's some expectation you have this organization, it's going to take some time to build and grow and nurture them. And then you're talking about like, you know, what are you going to do to nurture this organization, or how can this organization help you with things that you're doing? But like you were saying though, like if the group is really being like, we will push, we will ignore our organization, but we still expect them to grow anyway. Then it could
like they might when there's like where they're mad that it was so level 3 and they're like, look, we know that it's because we kept pushing things forward, but it's still annoying that it's 11 levels lower than us. Like they usually will understand when you tell them it's because they didn't spend the downtime, but if you've got a group that's that gung-ho, they're still not going to spend the downtime to get the organization benefits, even if it looks like really good benefits. Because
I feel like at that point you have to be like, you're going to invest it, or you're going to take some time to invest in the organization, or are you going to move on and like, no, forget the organization, Just
think of it as being a victim of your own success, because that means you successfully got the players so invested in whatever plot line that either you came up with or that they hooked onto in the sandbox that they wanted to advance it no matter what, or their characters thought it was so important that they couldn't take a break to stop. So that generally, while it can lead to serious issues for your pacing, it is a sign that they're very invested and they're very hooked on.
Or like, have you ever noticed in published adventures how many times you'll have a dungeon that has like a stereotypical room that is blessed to a good god or otherwise magically worded with a giant "this room is safe, please rest here" sign on it?
That's true.
I mean, that's kind of like the session by session equivalent of the "hello, please take a break."
But that's just kind of resting while staying in adventuring mode.
Yeah, but I'm saying...
I don't think anybody is like, well, in that case, we'll spend a week in doing downtime in that room.
No, but I mean, like, some of these things that we're talking about, I feel like are as on the nose as that. But, like, players are used to that idea, that sometimes you're going to have a thing that's like, hello, yes, you can take a break here.
That's right.
And it is important to make it clear to the players that, you're not going to say, oh, you took downtime and therefore, like, something terrible happened. You definitely don't want to set up an adversarial precedent where, like, oh, yes, well, because you took 2 seconds to rest, then this thing happened. Now, if you have a group that's like, nah, I'm going to take a month of downtime between everything, like, who cares? Yeah, I've heard these rumblings. Yeah, I've heard the rumors that the Lich King's going to invade soon, but I really just want to keep working at my bar, and you've given them a few warnings.
The Lich King's dungeon has 50 rooms. After each room, we'll take a month of downtime.
I mean, yeah, that's a slight exaggeration, but like, there could be some senses in which you have like given the players ample warning that that's the case. So I won't say like you could never be like hurry along or something bad will happen, but like, definitely if you have a group that's anxious about resting, you never want to do that.
That's right. And there are other ways that you can control the pacing that are similar to the suggestions that I made before if your group is too wanting to charge forward. Let's take an example where your group loves delving into dungeons. And they're part of an adventurers guild. So it's possible that the group clears the only dungeons, that the last dungeon that was known in the area that hadn't been cleared yet, and that they have to find another dungeon. In which case, if you have a subsystem where there's just a large organization with tons of people, you could explain. You could be like, okay, look, you guys can go out there and look for a dungeon yourself. But in general, like in this settlement, dungeons are only found every once in a while. And that's with hundreds or thousands of people looking for them. So the amount that your character can contribute to looking for it might take years of looking before you find it. Whereas if you use this guild subsystem to get, like, to start a clan in the Adventurers Guild, and you could build up your clan and have hundreds or thousands of people in your clan, in which case suddenly you'll start getting dungeons to unlock very quickly if you build up your clan, because you can send them all to look for new dungeons while you're clearing the dungeon.
Yeah.
Maybe at that point they'll find another one by the time that you're done.
So then, by participating in downtime, they've actually accelerated the rate at which they can figure things out. As you call it. Remember when dungeons were found under castles full of prisoners?
Those were the days. Those were
And
the
I also
days.
see another one. I feel Wildermyth does a good job of taking into account how things change as time passes. Yeah, Wildermyth is really fun when it's like, you skip forward in time and you see how the characters develop. Yeah. Oh, I just lost my train of thought.
Was it about the word dungeon?
No, it was before that.
Was it about the thing I was talking about where you can use downtime as a key to unlock adventures?
Yeah, another thing that you might
versa?
have, and where I actually thought you might have been going with that was, let's say they get to a barrier or door or something in the dungeon that they don't have the power to open it, then they have to go back and, like, research and figure out how they would open it. If there's something that can't just be solved by, like, repeated axing, but they actually have to, like, figure things out and consult others, those kinds of things can take time and then require some degree of downtime to achieve.
Though be careful, because once you require enough downtime to achieve the research part, there probably is a repeated axing version of downtime that might be faster, such as, well, we can't take down that barrier, so I'm just gonna dig through the ground under the barrier and then back up. I bet I can do that faster than that wizard. If the wizard's really going to take 2 weeks of downtime to research it, I know I can dig a hole under it faster than 2 weeks. And you're going to be like, well, the barrier's a perfect sphere and it goes through the ground. So you dig through the ground and then you find there's a barrier under there too.
Yeah. Well, I figure that you would probably do there is that, like, okay, you got that kind of party, then the door is actually like a dimensional portal, and you've been able to figure out that it's a dimensional portal, but the portal needs an appropriate key, and if you try to dig through the stone to the other side, you find that it's just the solid wall behind it, because it's a dimensional portal, and you can't axe a dimensional portal.
That's right. Even if you broke it, there would just be no way to get to the place you wanted to go to next, because you destroyed the dimensional portal.
Oh, I think Kitsune's had a lot of experiences here. If a barrier is a ball and you dig it right, can you just push it? Does it roll? Roll it into the sea!
Roll the barrier into the sea! Yes, there you go.
Hamster ball style.
Kojo says, are any of the Pathfinder 2e subsystems designed to encourage or reward downtime? There's some of them that are designed to be able to be used both in immediate play and over the course of a long period of time, including downtime. Like the leadership system can do that. You can have a downtime or long-term victory point system to determine the ending. And you can even be very clear to players and be like, look, you can rush this if you want. But some of these elements of the downtime system, if you leave them if you don't build them up and you rush to the ending, you're not going to get the good ending. Because one of the things that we check for the ending is how well these other elements have been nurtured. And the answer will be that you didn't nurture them at all, and you just rushed the Lich King. And with no infrastructure to help with the lands that were underneath the Lich King, and there's this diplomacy with the Orc side quest that you didn't do. And there's a lot you're going to leave on the table if you're just going to constantly keep rushing. That's a discussion you can have outside of character. And maybe they'll say, oh, I like the idea of doing these side things. Let's stop. I've been doing it. Maybe they'll say, why, though? We just kind of... we're all agreed we just want to rush this stuff. Why are we doing this? And then you might learn maybe you shouldn't do that. Maybe you should just let them rush do a Castlevania where the
Yeah.
entire thing is a giant Lich King castle, and you never
Yeah,
leave
and then
downside.
maybe you have like a short adventure where it's like, you know what, you guys are adventurers and you're super rich. Yeah, you can hire some people. Here, we'll do a short thing about hiring some people to handle some of these tasks, and they can make occasional reports to you on how it's going because they don't want to really engage with that.
Absolutely. So that is basically most of what I wanted to talk about in terms of pacing. Did you have anything else, Linda?
I see a comment in crafting. Do we still have crafting in the poll, or was
We have
that
crafting is what we're going to do on Saturday. So if you want to talk about crafting, then
crafting is going to be our topic on Saturday, so we can talk about it more. Then,
yes. So I've covered most of what I wanted to talk about with pacing in terms of look at your pacing as a spectrum between a pre-published adventure, which is still not completely static, to a sandboxy reactive campaign that's very improvised, which is still not completely improvised. Then you can use techniques from pre-planning and graphing the sine wave of your campaign going up and down for the pre-planned ones, to using improv techniques to sort of react but still try to get those same ups and downs when you're doing a more reactive campaign. Meanwhile, at the same time, making sure to have conversations with your players out of character to make sure you're all on the same page.
And if you have people in your group who are on dramatically different pages, you have one person who wants to kick back and spend a month working on their bar and customizing its one selection, and another person who just wants to chop everything down with an axe, then you may want to have two different campaigns running at the same time to accommodate those different pacing styles.
That's right. So that's where we're at. Let's say bye to YouTube and then do our poll. Bye, YouTube. See you next time.
Bye!